Erin Koller is a long-term friend and Regis Professor of Hebrew at the University of Cambridge.
Thank you. All right. Well, it's good to have come the 15 meters from Asian and Middle Eastern Studies over to classics to be with you all today. So thank you for accepting me, and thank you all for being here. What I'm going to try to develop today is based on work I've been doing on a book on global history of the alphabet. And as I was looking at alphabetic scripts around the world and over the last 4,000 years or so, it dawned on me that some of them seem to revel in their own aesthetic possibilities, whereas others seem oblivious to those possibilities. I have no grand claim to offer here. I certainly don't have an alternative universe to offer. Only some observations on the different ways in which alphabetic writing and an aesthetic sense have sometimes intermingled and intertwined, and at other times have refrained from doing so. So we have to begin a bit with non-alphabetic writing. By way of contrast, because the alphabet was born in a world of hieroglyphs. Now, the Egyptians were really good at exploiting the aesthetic potential of their writing system. The use of hieroglyphs by itself is actually enough evidence for that, because the Egyptian was, of course, biscriptal in the sense that they used hieratic for mundane, not only mundane, but mundane usage, and also preserved hieroglyphs for writing that was specifically meant to be aesthetic. An aesthetic, I'm going to use it in a very broad sense. It could be grand, it could be beautiful, it could be playful, but something more than functional. But the Egyptians were actually more than just preserving hieroglyphs. They were really attuned to the possibilities in the aesthetic use of hieroglyphs. I'm just going to give you a couple of random examples here. In this Old Kingdom plaque, the seated men and women on the bottom are technically classifiers following the personal names written above, but by making them larger, the scribe artist has also turned them into something artistic rather than just writing. Sometimes the hieroglyphs take the place of regular pictures. So in this one, much later, the man to the right is presenting fields, fields, to the sacred bull that's being mummified. But visually, instead of presenting actual fields, in his hand is the hieroglyph for field. This one point? No. Yes. Yeah. Hieroglyph for field. So the hieroglyph represents the thing in art. This one is one of the more fascinating examples. This is a tiny little, not tiny, little wooden palette-shaped thing. It's not an actual palette. The background that you need to know is that the word mer or merry means a whole bunch of things, but importantly, love and soft wood. These are presumably homonyms, not worrying about the vowels as we don't in Egyptian. But here, the phrase here, which is Meri Antiu Chesi Neferu, for Mary, the artist simply left out a sign and let the wood stand in for the homonym Mary, in other words, love, which is an amazing use of sort of a non-hieroglyph to stand in for a homonym. I am not sure even who would have understood this without someone explaining it to them. I learned it from an article by Antonio Loprieno, who is quite a brilliant Egyptologist. I'm not sure where he learned it from, but this is a really subtle and interesting use of the visual aspects of hieroglyphs. Now, Jan Assmann, the prominent Egyptologist, referred to this sort of general phenomenon as what I would translate as the figurative capacity of writing and the writing capacity of the figure in Egyptian writing. This was actually, come to this in a second, but this was actually a major problem in the decipherment of hieroglyphs. The assumption that writing ought to be functional, which was prevalent specifically, but not only in the West, up until 1822 and not entirely gone after that, precluded an understanding that art and writing may actually bleed into each other, which was actually a sort of cognitive block on understanding how hieroglyphs worked. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, the alphabet was born from hieroglyphs. Despite that, the aesthetic potential of early alphabetic writing is not exploited at all. And I should have included some pictures, but But if you look at early Greek writing, and that's of course late on the family tree, early Semitic writing, and I mean early, like Sirabit al-Khadim, earliest alphabet, but also even things like the Mesha Stela, which we have a cast of in the Fames Library across the courtyard. The most you can say about these inscriptions is that the letters are executed nicely. There's nothing more than that. There's no flourishes, there's no art. If they're on a straight line and with straight if they're on a straight line and executed with straight lines, then we say, wow, this is really impressive. This is like royal inscription sort of level. But that's a very low level of aesthetic exploitation. So what I want to do now is to talk about three different examples where the aesthetic potential of alphabetic writing was exploited in different ways. First of all, the serif. Everyone loves a serif. Takes a long time for anything aesthetic to develop. The very first serifs that we know of seem to exist in an inscription of Alexander the Great at Priene in southwestern Turkey. But they really come into their own in Latin inscriptions, of course. And these new little serifs, these subtle flourishes, are features that give that imperial flavor to a lot of the Roman inscriptions. This seems to me to be a really tiny change that actually bespeaks a major shift in the way people are thinking about letters, because for the first time, they're actually trying to make them into something beautiful. Now, why do they exist? That is, of course, an important question. There's one influential theory that comes from Father Edward Kitich, who was actually obsessed with the perfection of the Roman capitals on Trajan's column. In 1935, he got permission to erect scaffolding in front of the column, and over the next few years, spent countless hours studying those letters, making rubbings. And he actually developed a theory, which was that as a letter painter, he thought serifs were the most natural thing in the world. Because if you imagine a paintbrush of getting to the end of a line, so if you try to just pick it up, you'll wind up almost certainly with some sort of thing that tails off. So the natural thing to do is to add some sort of flourish at the end that sort of bespeaks the end of it. And so his theory was that serifs developed in monumental inscriptions because painters would come and paint the lines, and then the chiselers would come and chisel it, preserve those endings, and then they got formalized into serifs. Even if that's true, and it's possible but uncertain, that already bespeaks something aesthetic, because of course the chiselers could have ignored those flourishes at the end, even if the painters had to include them. The calligrapher, I couldn't find a picture of him, Oscar Agg, pointed out or suggested a different explanation, also an aesthetic explanation, which is that when one looks up above at an inscription that may be 5 meters above the viewer, and of course you don't get to typically set up scaffolding to get to eye level, letters appear to warp. The ends being the top, look narrower than the middle or the bottom. So to avoid this, the artist or carver compensate by making the ends a bit wider than the middle, and the widening, he suggested, then became regularized into a serif. Either way, and I'm really not worried so much about who's right. I think there's things to think about that. Either way, the point is that the Roman carvers seem to have been worried about the aesthetics of writing, and this is really the first time that we're seeing anything of that sort. Now, the letters on Trajan's column, which had inspired Father Kitich's insights, have had multiple afterlives. Sorry. Interestingly, inspiring numerous artists to emulate them, to riff off of them. Eric Gill, the great and deeply flawed artist craftsman, encountered the lettering on Trajan's column in the cast at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And his cast of those letters is now itself in the Victoria and Albert Museum. But more interestingly, Carol Twombly in 1989 was working for Adobe, the font designer. The head of the design team assigned her the task of creating a font based on Trajan's inscription for Adobe's historical series. So she created a new typeface called Trajan, and those letters on the column had then gone digital. They were used all over the place, maybe because of the Roman associations in the 1990s for big epic movies, and then it just became all over the place in all sorts of movies where you get the Trajan font, seems to bespeak something like grandiosity or power or something like that. I'm not going. Don't ask me any questions about the movies. They're all over. But Trajan, yeah. It is an interestingly controversial question whether serifs can help in reading, because that's an alternative to an aesthetic hypothesis. Would be that this is actually functional in some way. That they hadn't been noticed, but that once people introduced them, that they were actually useful. There's a recent monograph by John Richardson, which I'm just not going to read this whole thing, but the conclusion is, in fact, the copious evidence that has been reviewed in this monograph leads to the conclusion that there is no difference in the legibility of serif and sans serif typefaces, either when reading from paper or when reading from screens. Typographers and software designers should feel able to make full use of both serif typefaces and sans serif typefaces, even if legibility is a key criterion in their choice. That doesn't prevent people from fighting over them. Some of you might know the story. 1960, the United Kingdom had new highway road signs. David Kindersley is very upset at this new sign. You notice that the font is sans serif and also mixed case. Both of those he thought were catastrophes. And he writes an angry letter in which he says, "In letters to be read at a great distance, there is always a loss of definition. The serif reinforces the individual character of the letter exactly where this loss is greatest." So he designed this road sign, all uppercase, and with serifs on it. He lost, of course, as you know from road signs around Britain. But another variation on the typeface he designed is, in fact, ubiquitous around Britain for street signs rather than highway signs. Kindersley's workshop is represented here by people related. But it's also located in Cambridge. So Cambridge people might be happy to know that the current name of the font is the Kindersley Grand Arcade. And it's in fact on the Grand Arcade. So on St. Andrew Street, you can see that in action. Serifs, just the last thing I'll say about them, they get weirdly political. So maybe you've noticed a couple months ago the news story where Secretary of State Marco Rubio, in a country in which I may have once lived, banned the use of calibri on departmental paperwork because it's not dignified enough. It didn't specify that serifs were the issue, but that seems to have been how everyone understood it. That serifs somehow give a dignity to Secretary of State memos that are missing with a sans serif font. So the real point that I want to make with this all, though, is that serifs really are aesthetic rather than functional, and therefore the serifs can be seen as the first example of an aesthetic turn in alphabetic writing. Now, Arabic is an entirely different world. In a good way. So this is the second move that I want to quickly describe. In early Islam, writing becomes art, not just artistic or aesthetic, but it actually becomes art. This is most centrally seen in Quranic texts, but it extends to pottery, metalwork, building decoration. And there were philosophical reasons for this development. These are articulated in the 9th century, where we find Muslim theoreticians who have adopted Neoplatonic thought on geometry, coming to the conclusion that the geometric shape of letters, when done properly, of course, was the most direct way of accessing the representation of the divine in the world, which of course couldn't be figural, had to be representational and abstract. So writing the divine word in divine figures was exactly the best way to access the divine on paper or in visual arts. There's a push factor in addition to that pull factor, which is the aversion to other figural arts, which takes different forms in different strands of Islam. But these are all actually related to each other, and I won't say more about it. The Blue Quran, which is spread in different libraries around the world, different leaves of it. This one's in the Met Museum. Is probably one of the most lavish Quran manuscripts ever produced. The parchment's dyed with indigo. The script is actual gold. And Islamic calligraphy, which has been described really nicely in this book by Sheila Blair, developed in different ways in different traditions. For our purposes, the commonalities are far more important than the differences between those traditions. And a few years ago, 16 different countries joined together in having the tradition of Arabic calligraphy inscribed in UNESCO's Register of Intangible Cultural Heritage. Sorry. Now, the tradition of calligraphy sort of overflowed its banks, and even if the logic of it it has to do with the Quran and the divine word, it simply becomes the dominant motif in Islamic art. And much of Islamic art revolves around the letters of the alphabet. Two examples chosen essentially at random. These two because I used to live near them. They're both in the Brooklyn Museum with Kufic inscriptions. And this one, which is a different kind of art, Talra, which is essentially, as you see, a calligraphic monogram of a monarch. This one is Suleiman the Magnificent, and the large text actually reads Suleiman, son of Selim Khan, ever victorious. And then the bottom text says something else. So that's a remarkable use of letters to create art. Now that brings me. I should say one thing before I go to my third example. The Middle Ages do see also the development of writing as art in Latin worlds, so essentially in Christian worlds, and also a little bit in Hebrew manuscripts. Just going to touch on this. So we have the early figural depictions of the Chi-Rho, or the chirograph, even back in 4th century in carvings, and that gives rise to some of these ornate flourishes in the initial sections, initial letters of sections in manuscripts. This example is from the Clarissa Psalter in the Walters Museum in Baltimore, so-called because it actually says Clarissa here, is the girl swinging from the queue, is identified as Clarissa. This is the Book of Kells in Dublin, and I'm just mentioning these two examples. I'm not going to say very little about them. I mentioned two particularly early examples because these are early enough that there can't be Islamic influence here. So 8th century Ireland, not a prime candidate for Islamic influence. Whereas once we get to the High Middle Ages, there's a lot of evidence that Latin manuscript tradition is also being influenced by the Middle Eastern book, Hebrew and Arabic. But this must be an independent development of the aesthetics of manuscript art. Okay, and then the last example of the aesthetics of writing is a development that takes place in medieval Jewish manuscripts called micrography, which is also finds its way into other linguistic traditions as well, where the writing is not ornate, but on the contrary, is actually tiny and almost illegible, but is formed into shapes that themselves are art. So there are some, you see, I think it's from about 1300s Catalan Mahzor, so liturgical text. There are some earlier Latin examples of using writing in the shape of pictures, so the graphy part, but not the micro part. So the micrography seems to be original to Hebrew manuscripts. This continues in Latin in all sorts of interesting ways. But it continues in Hebrew as a Hebrew artistic tradition as well into the early modern and then the modern period. This 19th century, this one as well, 19th century micrographic drawing of so the entire Hebrew of the Book of Jonah is the text shaped into a boat. And you see there at the bottom, so if you zoom in enough, you see the words, and you also see how the artist shaped the words into the pictures. And the fish is about to swallow him alive. So these three examples provide varying approaches to the categories of the sort of intermingling of text and art. The Roman carvers wanted their unadorned text to simply be beautiful. The Islamic calligraphers and artisans used the text as art, and Jewish manuscript illuminators turned the art into yet another text. As I said at the outset, I don't have any grand theory to offer here. It seems worthwhile to cast a wider net and see how this has developed in other traditions. I'm sure as we do so, we will refine, extend, modify the taxonomy here, but I hope that it's at least a good place to start this conversation.